Hey everyone, it's Simi Shah, and welcome to Trailblazers. On this podcast, I dive deep into the journeys of trailblazing South Asians, sharing the stories of the leaders and dreamers lighting the way across the South Asian diaspora. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Saeed Ahmed, Director of Digital News at NPR. Before joining NPR in 2021, Saeed served as Assistant Managing Editor of CNN Digital. There, he spearheaded CNN's Content Diversity Initiative and created the top 2 newsletters in CNN's portfolio, 5 Things and The Good Stuff. He spent 13 years at the news outlet, first starting out as a news desk editor. He actually began his journalism career at a newspaper near and dear to my heart, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He joined their team for 7 years shortly after graduating from Morehouse College, a historically Black college. He was born in Bangladesh and raised in the United Arab Emirates, and he is a pillar in the journalism community, which is why I'm so excited to dig into his story. Welcome to Trailblazers, Saeed.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, given how long we've tried to make this happen.
Yeah.
And also, it is so good to be somewhere where people get my name right. The first time.
You are not the first person to say that, and it's one of the most heartwarming things I hear when I talk to people. And I will say the other Atlanta connection is also something that makes me feel very, very excited about this podcast. So I want to talk about the fact of how you were born in Bangladesh and then you were raised in the UAE, and then you ended up here in my hometown, Atlanta, at Morehouse College. Can you tell me a little bit about your upbringing and early career and journey to the States?
So yeah, I was born in Bangladesh. Then we went to the Middle East, United Arab Emirates. Abu Dhabi is where we were. And we were there until I was about 13 years old. So then we moved back to Bangladesh. Then I did my O-levels there, and then the first year of my A-levels. And then, of course, like many other kids in Bangladesh and in other parts of the world, I wanted to come to the US. And I had this crazy idea of this being a land of fast cars and I'll land a girlfriend as soon as I get here. And I wanted to be a rock star, right? Because I played in a band there. And of course, the way to get to the US at the time, I'm so old. This is way before the internet. So we had to go to the US Cultural Center, and there was a big, thick book called Barron's Colleges of American Universities. So you would go through that book. And for me and for others like me, it didn't really matter where we ended up, right? We just wanted to come here. So the thing that was a determining factor was which colleges gave a lot of scholarships. And so I picked a bunch of those. And then there was a thing called a common application where you just fill out one application, right? And then you send it to a bunch of places. And I did that. And then the acceptances would start coming in. And when an acceptance would come in, there was a form they would send, and you'd immediately look to the right to see what your cost would be. And when Morehouse came, it said 0, which meant that they were paying for my tuition, room, board, everything.
Wow.
And of course, I was crazy excited, except that I didn't know anything about Morehouse, right? Just like I wouldn't have known anything about DePaul if I went there, or Allentown College, or all of those places. So then first I found out it was all male. Then I found out it was predominantly African-American. And then there was a friend of mine, her brother was in college here, and he was the one who said, oh my God, you have to go there because MLK went there and Spike Lee went there and Edwin Moses went there. And so that's how I ended up here. It was me and a friend of mine. Fortunately, he came. So we were the first 2 Bangladeshis in, I think, the college's 150-year history at that time.
Wow.
So that's how we landed. And then, of course, my parents wanted me to be a doctor, so I majored in biology because I have an older brother and he was an engineering student. So I majored in biology, and so my first year I did an internship on campus with a professor in a bio lab, because very soon after I landed, I realized there's no way I can make it to med school because it costs too much money. I can't take out that kind of loans, etc. So my other alternative was to go into research, right? So I was doing research on campus and I hated it because research is basically doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different result. Whereas journalism is doing something and every day you could get a new result. It was the polar opposite. And my mom would write columns for newspapers, and then she would be on the radio. So there was a little bit of the journalism in my genes.
And this was here or back home?
No, this is back home. When I was growing up, I would see my mom sit at a table with a paper and pen in hand, eyebrows squinted, waiting for inspiration to strike, right? She didn't know what she would write about, what the column would be. And then suddenly it would hit her, and the look that would come over her, I wanted that feeling. I'm like, whatever that is, I want that. And so, when I was growing up, like many other kids, I would make these newspapers and I would photocopy them in my dad's office and then sell them to neighbors. It would have stuff like, Ahmed can't come out to play, has the flu, that sort of stuff. And they would pay me like in candy bars, etc. So there was a little bit of journalism there.
Wow.
Anyhow, so I came here, realized that I cannot do biology. I have to go into journalism. And at that point, Morehouse didn't have a journalism program. So the one way to get experience was to join the college paper. And I would keep going there and asking them to take me on, and they would say, no, we don't really need you right now. So one day I took a copy of the paper and I circled in red all the mistakes, and I put a yellow sticky note saying, this is why you need me. And so the next day they brought me on.
Wait, that's amazing. So you kind of started as like a copy editor.
Yeah. So that was the thing. If there are other journalism wannabes listening to your podcast at some point, a lot of us go into journalism, then we rise up the ranks in college newspapers, right? You become a general manager or a copy editor or an editor. No, I was doing the same thing until I went to a career fair, and there was a guy from Berkeley who said, if you really want to do journalism, you have to write. So I was like, okay, I got to give all of this up and just write. And then from that point onwards, all my internships were in journalism.
Wow.
That's how it started.
Wow. And so you start by studying biology in college. Initially, you wanted to be a rock star.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. So the rock star thing was, as soon as I landed and I went to Morehouse, people either listened to hip hop or jazz.
Okay.
And then when I saw these folks play jazz music, I'm like, there is no way I can do this. They are way too good, because jazz is on a different level altogether. So that was the end of my rock star dreams. With biology, I hated it so much, but then I still kept at it. So I would sit in a classroom and pretend I was in a news conference just so that I would take notes. That was the only way I could keep myself motivated.
Oh my God. So you were in character.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So then when did you get this first start at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution? How did that come about?
Every story that I'll tell you, there is a through line, which is seize the moment. The college newspaper one is an example. So at the Atlanta Journal, I wanted to get there for the longest time. And every year I would apply, they would turn me down for an internship, saying, basically, I was trying to do an internship in radio, in a wire service, in a magazine, because I thought it would make me well-rounded. For the people at the Atlanta Journal, they said, this just shows that you're not really sure what you want to do. So I'm sorry, we'll pass on you. But I kept at it during the school semesters. I would keep emailing their editors saying, is there anything you have going? So this was in the year 2000. It was an election year. Yeah. And Angela Tuck, who was a recruiter at the time, and she was also an editor, she called and said, hey, Atlanta Journal at that time was owned by Cox Newspapers, which had a lot of other newspapers as well. And so they said, we are trying to create a portal where we'll have the best of our political coverage. So we need someone to maintain it. Do you know HTML? And I said, yes, I do. I didn't know HTML. So they said, all right, come in on Monday, and then, you can work on a temporary basis until the end of the elections. So I went to the school lab on a Friday night. I was there all the way until Sunday night looking at source codes of websites, learning HTML.
Oh my God.
And so then when I went in on Monday, it was just managing it, right? Because someone had already created it. So all you had to know is how to bold and, all of that stuff. So I got the gig. I did that. That was a Bush v. Gore year.
Yep.
So the elections ran long. So my gig didn't end. And then in the spring, they said, okay, we're happy with what you did. We don't need you for elections, but why don't you just come work with us on digital on a part-time basis as you finish out your school year? I did that. Then I got the internship that summer. And I was so adamant on landing a job at the Atlanta Journal that I wrote for every section. I would write whatever they wanted me to write, but then come August and the internship is over, and Julia Wallace, who was the editor-in-chief, she said that, listen, you've been doing an amazing job, but we can't hire you straight out of college because whenever we did, the person lost their fire because they felt like they've arrived, right? So you need to start at a smaller paper and climb your way up.
Work your way up.
Yeah, and so she said, but what we'll do is we'll keep you on as a part-timer until you land something. So that was August, and then September 11th happened.
Oh my God.
And so on the day September 11th happened, Atlanta Journal, along with many other newspapers, were thoroughly unprepared. And here was me, a Muslim, who lived in the Middle East, spoke a little bit of Arabic, didn't really have connections to the community, but I could at least go in and out of mosques, etc. And I realized this is my opportunity. And I remember working 73 hours straight. I would do whatever was asked of me. And there were some really crazy things asked. For example, the day of the attack, they said, what we need someone to go and talk to people who work in tall buildings and ask them how they feel. And so I would go there with a notepad and ask a security person, excuse me, how tall is this building? How many stories are there? And then the guy would be like, who wants to know? And me looking like this, I wasn't really a full-time reporter, so I didn't even have a press pass or anything, so that was one crazy one. Yeah. The other crazy one was right after September 11th, they closed all the airports.
Yep.
And when they finally reopened them, I think 3 or 4 days later, because Atlanta was the busiest airport and probably still is, they wanted to do 24 hours in the life of Hartsfield. And that is when airports decided you can't really go into a terminal unless you have a ticket. Before that, anyone could come in and go. So they said, all right, we'll get 3 reporters. You're going to buy a ticket, go in, be there for 8 hours, talk to different people, and then right before your flight is about to take off, you say, I changed my mind, and you turn your ticket in so that it didn't cost the newspaper much. And so the ticket they booked me was leaving Atlanta at midnight, going to Miami, which is where one of the terrorists came from, and then returning back 6 a.m. the next morning. And I'm like, how much do you want to bet I'll get arrested? They said, no, you're not going to get arrested. So I'm like, I need the job. So I did that. And then right when I said, okay, I changed my mind and I was about to hand over the ticket, these guys said, hey, come with us. So they were obviously FBI agents. They took me to a room. They left the door open and they were asking me all these questions. What am I doing? Oh, so you're a journalist. Do you have a card? No, because I didn't. And they said, okay, well, let's call your office to see if anybody will verify. And it's the middle of the night and we're calling the office and nobody's answering. So eventually they let me go. And then the day before I was to go to Lexington, Kentucky to interview for my first job, the agency called and said, we're hiring you. Wow. And then the next morning, there was an email from Julia Wallace. She said, you proved me wrong. Now prove me wrong again.
Wow.
And that was the fire she lit. So yeah, that was my story of how I landed.
We could end the podcast right here. What an incredible story. Seize the moment really captures it. In that 9/11 happened, you realized that you had this unique perspective and could really add to the AJC's reporting and what they were trying to build. But sounds like you faced some experiences that could have been a little bit traumatizing or at the very least problematic. How did you take that in stride? How did you feel in that moment?
I don't know. It was a different time, right? Where I just needed to land a job and everything else was secondary. And to be able to land a job at a place like the AJC, I would do whatever it took. And when I started working there, I was a cop reporter. And if you want to talk traumatizing, oh my God, those were the craziest stories. And you were dealing with cops and you were dealing with victims. It was just horrific. But you either internalize it or you realize it's a job, you compartmentalize it. I feel like it would probably get to me a lot more now. But at that time, I came from Bangladesh. It was hard enough as it is here. And so everything else was gravy. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to get a full-time job. I'll do whatever.
It's interesting because in today's climate, if a young budding journalist were asked to do an assignment like that, it would potentially be considered problematic because they're either being tokenized because they belong to a certain community or have a specific identity, or they're potentially facing discriminatory behavior. What advice would you give to aspiring young journalists who are put in a situation like that, but just really want the job?
See, I think that this is a really fantastic time to be a journalist of color, right? Because when I was starting out, we were told, keep your identity at the door. Once you walk in, you're not a Muslim, you're not an immigrant, you are a journalist. You're going to worship at the altar of objectivity, right? Which was objectivity by white man standards, right? I'll give you an example. The Atlanta Journal was right next to the CNN Center at that time. And CNN Center was a hub of all kinds of protests, right? So there was a protest by some Palestinian group or pro-Palestinian protests. And I was working the weekend. And so one of my editors said, hey, can you go cover that? And there was another person in the newsroom who said, I don't think we should send him because he can't be objective. Can you believe that?
Wow.
The reason why I say that now is a great time to be a journalist, because A, you would really speak up.
Yeah.
At that time, I would hope that someone else would speak up on my behalf. Because what I really wanted to say is that this doesn't seem to apply to anything else. How are you covering European politics, or whatever? How are you covering religion or any of that? So my advice is a little convoluted, but it'll make sense. What is happening right now is, while it's a great time, there are two kinds of things. One, people are bringing in journalists of color, but then they are not nurturing them. So you come in through the door, you're working for these experienced journalists or old journalists who still worship in the altar of objectivity. And so they will either ask you to do the basic story about your culture or your community. So you have to kind of speak up. You have to say, this is not a story. This is a story. This is the reason why this is a story. On the other hand, there are some other news outlets where the pendulum has swung so much to the extreme where I can go and I can say, I want to do this story, and the well-meaning white editors will think, well, who am I to say that's not a story? So they will greenlight everything. So that also doesn't really foster growth in you. You have to be told no. You have to be told, why is it not a story? Both of these are dangerous extremes. And so a good journalist, a young journalist, will need to cultivate some mentors and be able to navigate the two, so that they are not either led astray or left stranded, or they are just learning nothing.
Wow, I'm glad you shared that, because it's not something that would have occurred to me, and I'm sure doesn't occur to a lot of people. Given the fact that you're in a senior leadership role at NPR today, how do you try to walk that line?
So I don't have to anymore. You had Mitra on your show.
Yes.
When Mitra came to CNN, my whole life perspective and view into journalism changed. And the reason is because she was the first person who came in and said, your identity matters, what you have to say matters, the stories you do matter. And if you don't do them, then that matters as well. Up until that time, it was all, I'm a journalist. I don't want to be tokenized. I don't want to be pigeonholed into writing about just one community, because you want to do it because you feel like you have to do it. So right now, what I tell the journalists of color in my newsroom and elsewhere is, I would like you at the end of every week to ask yourself, what story did I do this week that if I didn't do it, it wouldn't get done? And if you can point to even one every week, that means you're making a difference. And if you can't, then you have to ask yourself, why not? Is it because they're not getting greenlit? In which case, you and I have to have a conversation on how can we get these greenlit? Or B, are you just not pitching those stories? In which case, you really are not taking advantage of the opportunity that's been presented to you right now. I'll give you a funny story. So when I moved from the Atlanta Journal to CNN, same thing happened. It was in 2007. Pakistan was having an election when Benazir Bhutto was coming in to run again. And there was all this talk that, she could very well get assassinated. So CNN at that time needed someone who spoke Urdu and knew about the region. And I learned Urdu when I was in elementary school. So when I interviewed and they said, do you speak Urdu? I'm like, yeah, totally. So I got the job. And then when you start, you have 2 weeks of orientation. On the second day of my orientation, Benazir Bhutto was assassinated. And so they called me at home And they said, we need you to come in because she's been assassinated. We need your language skills. That was the longest shower I ever took in my life because I'm like, I am so going to get exposed. I haven't spoken Urdu since elementary school.
Oh my gosh.
But then I went there and, it all came back. I did an amazing job. But once again, seizing the moment and the opportunity and being able to deliver, right? And the same thing happens. I keep saying we are in this amazing time where your identity matters, but you have to make it matter. Just getting in through the door is not good enough.
Wow. I wish all journalists could hear this because, especially your point on the pendulum and how you manage that in your own newsroom and have managed it in your own career, I feel like is so relevant, especially to new entrants in this industry and people even from the outside like myself looking in. I want to spend a second on what you just touched on, this story about how you spoke elementary Urdu when they expected you to speak expert Urdu, but you speak 5 languages, Bengali, Urdu, Hindi, you can read Arabic. What are the ways in which your South Asian heritage, in this case your language skills, have impacted your abilities as a journalist and reporter?
So the Bhutto example was a good one where I was able to use my Urdu skills, right? With my Bengali skills, there were several times when I was at CNN when there would be horrendous tragedies in Bangladesh where I would go there and I was able to cover it. Even when I went there, I would still get a minder, someone who spoke really good Bengali and someone who could navigate the Byzantine, red tape, etc. But it helps, right? And it doesn't really have to be you have to go to Bangladesh or you have to go to India or you have to go to Pakistan to really harness the uniqueness that you bring, right? It could be what you do in your daily life. Yeah. So in other words, a couple of months ago, there was a case where I think a family of Pakistani origin in Canada, they went out for an evening walk. And then I think the father, mother, and son was gunned to death. I don't quite remember the specifics. What I do remember is an intern coming to me and saying, we need to do a different story on this because taking a walk after dinner is such a big part of our identity. They call it Hazam walk or something. I had no idea. But what an interesting concept. And if she hadn't brought it up, we would still be writing regular stories. Okay, this person's dead, the family is upset, etc., etc. But just that concept and how it's not just like a South Asian thing. Other cultures have it too, apparently.
Yeah.
You just have to know what it is that you know and how much of a value that knowledge is at a particular moment.
Yeah.
And then speak up. And then if you have the right editors, they will realize that, oh, wow, this is a good story. And then they'll give you the green light. But if you have the wrong editors, then we will find you a new job.
Okay. So it's incredible just to hear the range of experiences you've had to date. And it sounds as though you've had a number of opportunities that tie directly back to your South Asian heritage. I know you co-produced a documentary called Operation Hope about a Bangladeshi boy. You once field produced from Bangladesh, and you've set this tone for coverage of major stories coming out of South Asia. What has it been like working on such personal projects for major national news outlets?
So the story, just very briefly, there was a boy in Bangladesh who was brutally maimed because he refused to beg. Because there are all these gangs, right? They'll kidnap the boys and then they'll maim them so that they don't have an arm or a leg, and then they send them out to beg. This boy decided not to do it, and then they really chopped him up. And I know it sounds terrible when I say the word chopped him up, but they literally did. So Sarah Seidner at CNN, she did a story on the boy. And then there was some person in America said, I'm so moved by this that I want to help pay for his recuperation. And so that's how it became an hour-long documentary, because we brought him here. The surgeons at Johns Hopkins reattached parts of his body. And so I was part of that. And then that ended up winning an award, which was good gratification. But the fact that we were able to do such an amazing thing, that's what I mean when I started this conversation earlier, that with research, you do something over and over, expecting that one thing, which is going to be the breakthrough. But in journalism, it is every single day where you're given that opportunity, right? Yeah. I'll give you an example. There was a woman who was collecting all the artwork that was left on the fence outside the White House right after all the Black Lives Matters protests. So she was collecting them because they were tearing down the fences and they would just be tossed. So she had so much. And so the guy wrote a story about this woman. And then the next day, he's bombarded with calls from different museums wanting to house them. This is a story that probably took him like 35 minutes to maybe an hour. But what a difference that immediately made in the life of the woman who was tearing her hair out, not knowing what to do with all of this stuff, but knowing that they needed to land somewhere. One other thing I was going to tell you is there is a difference between me as an immigrant and other American journalists of South Asian descent. And what I mean by that is me and Mitra would have these conversations where I told her that I feel like I have come into this so late. By this, I mean championing South Asian journalists and stories, etc. Whereas I feel like you, Mitra, have done it all your life. And her answer to that is yes, because I was born an American and I was born knowing that these are my rights. Whereas me, Saeed, the first half of my life was just trying to survive, right?
Yeah.
Like, I need a visa. I need my
Put
green
food
card.
on
my
the table.
citizenship.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is not a pass for anyone else like me who's coming in now, but I do understand that there is a little bit of a difference between the two dynamics and how sometimes journalists who just come in sometimes spend a lot of their time fitting in, quote unquote, before they can really try to make a difference.
I appreciate you sharing this because it's an important thing for all of us to internalize that just because we share the same heritage doesn't mean that we've had the same experience, and we ought to show each other some grace and remember that. When we come back, more from Saeed on his vision for NPR and what he sees for the future of journalism. But first, a message from Desi Way. Sometimes the best way to connect with our culture is to integrate it into our everyday lives. Whether it's their signature game show mug or Diwali-themed ugly sweater, Desi Way's clothing, accessories, and homeware fuse South Asian culture with everyday wears. So start living your life the Desi Way today at etsy.com/shop/Desi Way and get 15% off your order with the code Trailblazer. Now back to our episode. I want to backtrack a little bit to your time at the AJC because it's no secret that local papers in America have often been the linchpin of journalism, democracy, freedom of the press, etc., etc. They've often broken some of the most important investigative stories far before the national news outlets did. Can you speak to any such experiences at the AJC, potentially about the piece that made your team Pulitzer Prize finalists?
I don't know if you were in Atlanta, and actually you probably weren't even born, or maybe you were, I don't know. There was a guy named Brian Nichols. He was in court, and then I don't know what happened, but it was, I think, 3 or 4 days long manhunt. He shot the judge, he shot the bailiff, he came out of there, he kidnapped a woman, basically to carjack her and run away in her car. Then he carjacked somebody else, and it just went on and on and on. So that was something we covered, obviously, that can only be covered on a local level. You can't parachute in, right? Yeah. You can. Other national outlets do parachute in, but that's where your connections with your law enforcement officials or your judges or whomever covering these stories day in and day out really come in, because that's how you know that this is how you're going to land that one story that no one else can. The funny thing about that is, so this guy, Brian Nichols, when he was arrested, we needed a photo. And we just could not find a photo of the guy. And I remember the guy who was the managing editor at the Atlanta Journal saying, I need the photo of this guy today. If I don't get it, somebody's going to get fired. It was a different kind of time. And of course, we just all hustled to try to see what we could do. But thankfully, one of our photographers landed it right when he was being handcuffed. But yes, you are right. People keep saying that newspapers are dying, but news isn't. Local news isn't dying, it's thriving, and it'll keep thriving more and more, which is another reason why outlets like Axios, etc., are investing in local issues, right? And that's the other thing where I see that a lot in young journalists now, where they will reach out to me and they'll be like, how can I land a job at NPR? Or I want to start at CNN. And then you say, well, what about Walla Walla Union Tribune if you're from Walla Walla, right?
Yeah.
Washington. And then like, no, I don't really want to do it. I would rather go get a graduate degree at Columbia or whatever, right? Because what that does is it gives you the connections, right? And then you can bypass that. But while you're bypassing that, what you're also bypassing is all that experience, where now we have a lot of journalists who are really good at picking up the phone, making a call. And if somebody hangs up on you, they hang up on you. It's very different than somebody pointing a shotgun in your face and saying,
get off my property.
Right? Yeah. I'll give you some examples. When I was a reporter, there were a couple of things I would do. Whenever I would go to a crime scene, I would carry a packet of cigarettes, even though I didn't smoke. And so I would look around to see whoever's sitting somewhere in abject despair. And you'd sit next to him because you know that this is either like a family member or something. You would offer the guy a cigarette. They'd start smoking. They'd just start talking. And then you'd say, hey, before you go any further, I'm a reporter or whatever, as opposed to just going there with a notepad and going, how do you feel? Which immediately puts people on the defensive because I'm like, I am grieving. So those are the kinds of things that if you start at a place like the Walla Walla Union Tribune or any local paper, you learn. You learn that City Hall is covering city council meetings is really boring, but that's where the stories lie.
Wow.
That's what ProPublica does, right?
Yeah.
Like they will go digging, and then find something incredible.
Wow. So fascinating. I love hearing about how you cut your teeth as a journalist because it reminds me a lot of the stories my dad shares with me about when he immigrated to America, all the things he had to do to hustle and be scrappy to start his own small business. But to that end, you had an amazing time nurturing yourself as a journalist at the AJC. What eventually prompted you to leave the AJC and go to CNN? Was national news something that you always envisioned for yourself?
No. Thank you for that question, because this is another good tip for any journalist. When I started off, I wanted to be an international correspondent. And then I started doing local news. I was covering cops and crimes, and I loved it. I loved cops and crimes, right? And then I was moved to, like, say, the national desk to cover immigrant communities, and I loved doing that. The bottom line of that is I just loved journalism. So it didn't really matter what beat it was. I just loved it. So I say that to say to everyone who's listening is that don't really box yourself in that I want to be an international correspondent and that's all I'm going to be. It will happen.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, just go in that journey. It's never going to be a straight path. It's zigging and zagging and you'll land at lots of different places. So for me, the reason I went to CNN was A, the opportunity to write about South Asia, and then B, because I wanted to be an editor.
Yeah.
That was just the next obvious transition for me. And then also CNN, because that's the other thing. With my parents, when they finally accepted the fact that I wasn't going to be a doctor, they would always keep saying, well, when are you going to be on CNN? And I would joke that even if I was a janitor at CNN, they would just be like, oh my God, my son is at CNN. Nothing against janitors, but I just use that as an example of, it didn't matter what role I was playing.
Yeah.
So then, of course, when I was at CNN, they were very proud. And there was one time I went to Bangladesh to cover one of their elections. And so I took a photo of when my dad was voting. So it was just a photo of his hand with the ballot going into the ballot box. And then I sent it. So it was on the website. And then whenever they would have, every 15 minutes, they'd say, Bangladesh had its elections. And they would show that picture. And he was so happy.
Oh.
He called all his relatives to be like, that's my hand. That's my hand.
It's shared on WhatsApp a million times.
Yeah. Every hour, 15 to the hour and 45 to the hour, my hand's going to be on air again.
That's amazing. So you touched on an interesting point that you felt like becoming an editor was a natural next step in your career. And it seems like, obviously, as you advance through a career in journalism, that's what happens. You spend a little bit less time as, say, a beat reporter and someone that's focusing on the higher level mechanics of how a fuller organization or arm of the organization runs. Is that something you ever grappled with, spending a little bit less time in the weeds of reporting itself?
So when you're a reporter will always tell you that I never want to be an editor because you don't get a byline. And reporters live and die by bylines, and they get to go to scenes, they get to talk to sources. It's a lot of fun, right? I grappled with it in the sense that when I became an editor, there were times when I would say, oh, I wish I could write this story. But that wasn't my job anymore. My job was to try to nurture and grow a group of people who could write that story. And so it took a while to get over the not seeing my own byline. But then it was replaced by, now I can really start making a difference. Because before, I could make a difference on my story level, right? Like I could write a story. If I didn't write it, nobody would write it. But now I could really start molding a group of people and opening their eyes so that they know that, can we cover stories this way? Maybe not. And then when I came to NPR, it was exactly the same next natural step, where instead of a team that I could mold and grow, can I do it across an entire department? And the higher up you go, what motivates you and what you find fulfilling change. And what I find most fulfilling right now, more than anything else, is just placing journalists in newsrooms and then nurturing and cultivating and growing them. And, it's funny, there are a bunch of people now that I'm in DC who I talk to, but I've never seen them. And I've placed them in different places, and they'll call and say, I'm doing great here. And I'm like, okay, maybe one day we should meet up so I know what you look like.
Wow. And it's also probably a product of COVID.
Yeah, that's also true. Exactly.
Yeah. So I want to come to your time at NPR, but before we do, I'm going to double click on CNN because you led so many amazing initiatives while you were there, launching products like their most popular newsletters, creating a class on digital storing, launching an internship program, and so much more. Can you highlight some of your most memorable experiences?
Obviously, 5 Things. 5 Things is a newsletter we launched. We won 2 Webbies for it. CNN Plus is a streaming service of CNN that they're launching, and there's going to be a TV version of 5 Things. So that makes me immensely proud. And the reason why I'm so proud of it is because it really started as a flicker, right? That we need to do a newsletter at a time when people weren't doing newsletters. It's not like I dreamed of it before anyone else and I realized that there is a value to newsletters. I just thought that we need to do it. And for the first couple of years, we just toiled in anonymity, trying to grow traffic, and it wouldn't grow. And then it just exploded. And it's not just because it exploded automatically. Of course, there were people helping grow it, but it also exploded because we had a writer called Doug Chris, and then later on AJ Willingham, who had a really good voice, and people really felt kinship. Yeah. There is nothing more personal than an email that you get in the morning, because as soon as you wake up, you reach for your device and it's right there. And if there's somebody talking to you and delivering the news in a very friendly sort of way, it resonates with you. Yeah. So 5 Things was great. And then the other thing that I'm very, very proud of is, we won an Emmy last year for a interactive we did on the ridiculous ways police gear up whenever they're responding to protests. So I'm proud of that because there's a nice little bookend to my CNN career.
Yeah. Wow. On the newsletter front, how incredibly prescient given the explosion of newsletters that we're dealing with today. And in that realm, you touched on the fact earlier that there's so many young journalists that are bypassing the traditional experience to get that journalism major. I'm sure a lot of them are going the Substack route and launching their own newsletter. As someone who's been at the vanguard of journalism for the better part of 2 decades now, what are your thoughts on this evolution? Newspapers are dying, but news isn't. The way we consume news is so different. How has that impacted you and the work you're doing today, even at NPR?
The first tip that I tell people is the one I shared with you, right? Like, what have you written this week that if you didn't do it, no. The other thing is I tell people that I don't want to become irrelevant. And the older I get, the risk of becoming irrelevant gets more and more because there are new modes of information dissemination coming. And so we have to be on top of it, right? So that's why what I love about young journalists right now is you look at their resumes and they've done podcasts and they've done writing and they did a little video edit. They are Jacks and Jills of all trades, which is such a departure from what I told you earlier. Remember when I was trying to land that AJC job and they said, because you're doing too many other things because you're not really full. So it's come full circle where there is a value in this. So it's incredible what you just said, that the modes of information dissemination keeps changing. And we have to know what they are, and we need to, if not master it, be familiar with it. So the other day I was sitting there thinking, what should our goals be going forward? And one of them is audio, right? Like, audio storytelling is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. All the traditional publications are investing in audio. You have Clubhouse, Twitter Spaces, etc.
That's why we're here today.
Yes. And then smart speakers are going to be another big frontier. Already they are. I want something where I want to be able to sit at my dinner table and be like, Alexa, quiz me, right? And then it'll just give me a lot of different quizzes. I can do that with Jeopardy now, but I want that with news. And so somebody, if you want to steal this idea, go ahead, pick a news organization and do it, because I haven't made much traction, but I'll get that going. So the other thing that I tell young journalists is, just because you didn't land the internship at NPR or at CNN doesn't mean you shouldn't just keep writing. And start with something that you're interested in. If you love Olivia Rodrigo, just start something and talk about, that just sounds creepy, sorry. But if you like pop music, start a newsletter or something, just so that you have the habit going, and we'll come to you. We'll realize that there's a value in that. You do that so well, we don't. We want to learn from you, so we'll bring you on. I cannot keep saying this over and over again, how excited I am to be doing journalism at this time, and what a great time it is for journalists of color with their skill sets to be part of this movement.
Wow. This makes me so happy to hear, because something that I personally have struggled with is that whole jack of trades mindset, because we have so much at our disposal today, but I've tried to find ways like trailblazers to channel it into real passions of mine. And it's exciting to see someone like you excited about that.
Well, yeah. The alternative is why newspapers died, right?
Yeah.
They did not evolve. I teach a lot of these classes now in writing and how to be more digital. I was talking to this one newspaper the other day. I was telling them the value of conversational writing, because that's how people read on the web, and not the stilted AP stodgy newspapery style. And the person said that most of our print subscribers are older, and if we take on the conversational model, we will lose them. And in my mind, I didn't say it out loud, but I'm thinking that you will eventually lose them anyway, because they'll die. They'll age out and die, right? So the question isn't, are you afraid because you'll lose the audience you have, or do you want to grow the audience? And so if you hold on to the audience you have, that's when you don't evolve and you have the problems.
And you face becoming obsolete.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your new role at NPR, which you've been in for almost a year now. You were at CNN for 13 years before being named Director of Digital News. What made you decide to take on this role, and what has it been like thus far?
Since we're in this mode of doling advice to young journalists, one of the things that I am envious of and proud of with young journalists is how they flit from job to job. At least in my case, it was a very safe immigrant mentality. Like, I need a job. It's a good job. I'll stay there, right? So, and that's why I stayed there for 13 years, right?
Yeah.
But if I were to do it all over again, I would move around a lot, because the more you move around, the more you learn about yourself. You can bring something to the job. You take something from the job, and then you apply that elsewhere. So when I moved from CNN to NPR, it wasn't because I was unhappy at CNN. I loved it. I still love everybody that I worked with. It's just, I sat down and I wrote what it is that I want to do next. And what I wanted to do next was be in charge of a digital outlet somewhere where I can decide what the tone would be of the way we write, what kind of stories we would write. I wanted to be part of something where I could dabble a little in audio, deal with smart speakers, do newsletters, do social. And this job allows me to do all of that. But more importantly, what it allows me to do is determine what we cover and how we cover it. And it is very fulfilling, frustrating, obviously, at times as well, because there's a million things you want to cover and you can't get to it right away.
Yeah.
But it's very fulfilling, because at this point in my career, that's what you want to do. The true difference that you can make are A, change the way we cover things, and B, bring on people who can write the stories. And I am at a place right now in an organization, thankfully, which is allowing me to do that. I'm bringing in so many journalists of color. And I'm so proud of that and how diverse my team is right now. And not just for diversity's sake, but because the stories that are coming out are so much richer.
Yeah. Wow. So I want to spend another second on that because you have been such an outspoken champion of diversity in the newsroom for so long now, particularly for BIPOC and LGBTQ plus identifying journalists. Recently, there's been increasing scrutiny around NPR as 4 hosts have left, 3 of them being women of color. Can you speak to your perspective on the issue of diversity in the wake of these departures and how you hope to push the needle moving forward?
The amazing thing about NPR is the fact that when these hosts left, people cared so much, right? Like it became a story, which means people care so much about NPR. It's almost like family. So when they lose family members, they want to know, why are we losing family members? How can we fix it? And then the second amazing thing is we have a public editor, which no other newsroom in America has. She wrote a story about why we're having this problem. And then our media critic, he wrote a story. So it is very refreshing to be at a place where they realize that, wow, this is either a problem or could become a problem. And they're very open about it, sharing with the rest of the world. And so if you read either of those, there were multiple reasons that they cited. One was, the contract negotiations. The other was
Great Resignation.
Yeah. To me, the heartening part of it is, and I tell my team when they felt under the weather over this, is that there is a different way of looking at it. And the way of looking at it is there is such value in audio, like I said, that every news organization wants to invest in it, but they have to poach the best talent. And where are they finding that? In the place that's been doing it the longest. So let's get it from there, right?
Yeah.
So it's a loss that these hosts who have been there for a long time have left. But hopefully this also creates opportunities for so many other people to rise up to the ranks where they are also that marketable and prized that people will lure them away. And then you bring some other folks on. I mean, yes, there are many things that NPR has to work on, but speaking for my team and myself, I feel very comfortable that the folks that I'm bringing in, I am not just going to leave them in a lurch, that I will ensure that they get the right kind of training and the backing and the support for them to keep growing. And then if they go somewhere else, I'll kind of be proud about it because I know that you've unleashed more amazing people into the world.
Yeah. Well, that's the sign of an amazing mentor, right? Seeing people grow, even if it's not necessarily under your wing.
Yeah.
I'm curious, NPR is a different sort of organization than who you've worked for in the past, given that it's, like you said, audio forward and has been for a very long time. It's privately and publicly funded. Can you speak to some of the changes and dynamics being at National Public Radio?
There are many. So, for example, at CNN Digital and at every for-profit organization, you want to grow traffic because the more you grow traffic, the more you can charge advertisers, right? But at NPR, you don't have advertising per se. We have sponsorships, right? So growing traffic cannot be our motivation to do good journalism on the digital space. It has to be something else that incentivizes us. So that's very fulfilling, right? That I'm not just writing stories for traffic's sake. I can do the kinds of stories that my folks want to do and I would want them to do. One of the things that NPR did, which is so amazing, is we realized that diversity doesn't only mean bringing in new folks. It also means diversity of perspective. Every news organization keeps calling the same experts over and over again. So what NPR did is they created this database. So you type in, I want to talk to somebody about economics in California. So they have all these vetted experts who are scholars of color that you can call so that you're not just getting one perspective, right? Because you can talk to like a white scholar about COVID's impact and get a really good answer. But if you talk to like, say, a Latina woman, she may have a very specific answer about another aspect of it. So NPR not only created the database, we made it available to anybody around the world. Any news organization can look at the database and call the experts. And I love that, the fact that we are creating a culture and then not just hoarding the information. Yeah. We're sharing it. The writing class that I did at CNN, we did a similar thing at NPR. But again, it's everywhere online. So you don't even have to come to the class. You can just download the stuff from our site. Whatever we do, we'll just make it available to anybody. That's our public service mission. And it's a fantastic feeling.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And I think the growing nature and culture of open sourcing information, data, resources is really powerful because it tends to democratize things, uplift people who haven't traditionally been uplifted in this case. So I really love that. The last question I have for you today is, you've done such amazing things over the course of your career thus far in journalism, and I have no doubt so many other amazing things to come. But say you were to leave this job in a decade, what would make you look back and feel proud of your time at NPR and in journalism, broadly speaking?
So at NPR, what would make me proud is what I came here for, which is whenever someone hears that I work at NPR or anybody works at NPR, they say, oh my God, I love NPR. I listen to it all the time. I want them to say, oh my God, I love NPR. I go there all the time, which means it could be listening. It could be podcasts. It could be the site. So I want people to think of NPR more than just the radio product. If I am able to do that, then I will feel like I've done my job. That's on the professional end, right? But the thing that would make me the most proud is whenever I get these tweets from someone who says, I am here now, but I couldn't have been here without mentors like Mitra or Saeed or whatever. I joke and I tell them that the reason I help you is because at some point I'll be old and I'll need a job and you'll give me the job. But the real reason is that I cannot tell you how fulfilling it is to notice talent, identify it, nurture and grow it, and then see them just soar. This is what teachers did, right?
Yeah.
This is why teachers love teaching. And I'm kind of feeling that a little bit, and it feels amazing.
Yeah. I think one of the most powerful parts of your whole story and career arc is it seems like you went from the person who was learning, cutting his teeth, to now someone who's transformed, who's still in journalism and in this role, but very much, like you said, in the teacher mentorship role, paying it forward.
Yeah, everybody. When I was cutting my teeth, there were some people who took me under their wings, right? They didn't have to.
Yeah.
But they did. And so if I don't do that, then somebody who's learning from me won't do it either. So it is paying forward, and that's how it goes on. And also, journalism is such a small field. Your paths cross over and over again.
Yeah. Here we are talking about you and Mitra.
Yeah, exactly.
Two of my idols in the same field. Well, Saeed, it's been so wonderful having you on Trailblazers. I can't even tell you how energized I feel after having this conversation. Media is in so many ways a personal passion of mine, and seeing someone like you at the helm is really, really exciting. So thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for empowering the next generation of journalists in so many different ways.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun being here.
Before you head out, I have a quick message from Introspectively Styled. In the mood to show yourself some pyar? Introspectively Styled, a South Asian female-owned business, curates casual apparel and accessories, each spreading messages of self-love and mindfulness, all with the South Asian twist. Get yourself a self-pyar sweater or a Change Your Kahani tee, available at introspectivelystyled.com, and use the code TRAILBLAZERS for 20% off your first order. Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you want to get new episodes straight to your inbox, subscribe to our newsletter at southasiantrailblazers.com and follow us at South Asian Trailblazers on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.